Okay, vielen Dank für die Einladung. Ich bin froh, wieder in Deutschland zu sein. Ja, ich wäre. Es ist mein erstes Mal in Göttingen. Ja, ich muss leider auf Englisch meine Anrede halten. Wie bitte? Vortrag, okay. And I'm going to give you a kind of brief overview of the book that I wrote last year, which, as has just been described, The Road to Somewhere, which is, it is focused on Britain, but I think a lot of what I'm saying is relevant to all developed countries, really, particularly in Europe and the US or North America. It's really a kind of work of amateur social psychology rather than political science, I would say. I look pretty closely at British social attitude surveys, opinion and attitude surveys, going back many decades, looking at the evolution of the world views and values of different groups in British society. As has just been said, I looked at the divides that have, in order to try and understand what's been happening with the Brexit vote, with Trump, with the rise of populism, and the book did better than I expected. It was very briefly a bestseller even in the UK, and one of the reasons for that, I think, is that it was very well timed. It was one of the first books to come out. Came out in March 2017. It was one of the first books in the UK, anyway, to come out with a kind of general theory of why this political turbulence was happening. And it was also perhaps because I coined a couple of labels. I created a couple of labels to describe the two big worldviews that I talk about in the book: the people that see the world from anywhere and the people that see the world from somewhere. What would that be in German? Help me, come on. Right, okay, I know you understand it, but anyway, we can work that one out later. But I mean, first, a bit of the kind of general context in which these value divides. I mean, I essentially see what is happening. I'm less pessimistic than many people. I see what is happening is not a crisis of democracy. It is democracy working in many ways, and we're seeing a kind of rebalancing of our societies. Away from the interests of the dominant value groups. I wouldn't call them an elite. I don't think, when I think of an elite, I think of what, 2, 3, 5% of a population. When I talk about the dominant anywhere group, one might very loosely describe them as the kind of liberal graduate classes of Europe. We're talking about a lot more than an elite. We're talking about 20, 30% perhaps of the population. This group has essentially dominated the politics, the culture, the economics of our societies, and indeed of the European Union. Indeed has over-dominated. This is really one of my theses. And what we're seeing is a democratic pushback against this over-domination. So we should not panic about it. It has some unpleasant manifestations sometimes, but this is democracy working, is one of my theses. And what is essentially, what is it that people are pushing back against? They're pushing back against an extraordinary 30 years plus in which liberal arguments, liberal in the broadest sense of supporting openness, supporting often quite the movement towards much more fluid and open societies whether it's in openness towards trade, openness towards immigration, openness towards that big fuzzy concept, globalization. And essentially, since the late 80s, early 90s, liberals, also in the cultural sphere, have won every single argument perhaps until Brexit in 2016. And it was a great shock. For people that are used to winning every argument, it's a great shock. And some of them, I think, have been behaving rather badly. They're not used to losing arguments. So let's just run through some of the things that have created the context for today. So we had the end of the Cold War. The Cold War obviously acted as a kind of discipline for Western countries. They had a common enemy in the Soviet Union that helped to structure politics in many ways, both collectively and internally in our societies. We had, I think, a really crucial thing, and I think, and sometimes we skate over this today, but I think one of the really crucial steps towards the new openness, as one might call the developments of the last 30 years, was the involvement, the support even of the moderate left, the social democratic left, or the Democrats in America, the centre-left parties of, New Labour in the UK particularly, but many of the other European social democratic parties, essentially, after the period of marketization of the 1980s, the so-called Reagan-Thatcher revolution, the left essentially, the moderate left, made its peace with that new settlement. And it made its peace, it essentially said, we have no choice but to accept much of the new market openness of our societies. We have no choice but to accept globalization. However, our role as social democrats is to equip the least successful, the least affluent, the least well-educated people in our societies for this new era. Robert Reich wrote his famous book, The Work of Nations, in the late 80s or early 90s. He was Bill Clinton's Labour secretary. We have very similar thinking going on in New Labour. And I think one of the kind of forgotten underlying causes, if you like, of what's been happening recently is that the promise that the Social Democrats made was never realised, at least in the US and UK, slightly different in continental Europe, and perhaps particularly in Germany, actually. But the promise that we will equip you, we will retrain you for the new world, we'll turn you all from, I don't know, coal miners and steel workers into technicians, simply did not happen. It just did not happen. It hardly happened at all in the United States or the United Kingdom. It did happen more in Germany, partly because of the Mitbestimmung system. You cannot make large redundancies, as you know, without a social plan. We have nothing like that, as you also know, in the United Kingdom and the United States, and it did not happen on any significant scale. So we had rapid deindustrialization. I think one of the big scars, the so-called left behind voters that we talked about a lot after 2016. This goes way back. This is not a recent phenomenon. It has been accentuated possibly by the shift from GATT to the WTO and the much greater opening, the emergence of China onto the world market. China and India, obviously from a global point of view, there have been huge benefits from that in terms of reductions in world poverty and so on. But as we all know, the one group that has not done well out of this big change is poorer people in rich countries. China joins the WTO in 2001. That led to a kind of new round of deindustrialization, particularly in the United States. Large parts of the supply chain were essentially moved to China. And this is very much, Steve Bannon, if you listen to Steve Bannon talking, his big project is bringing the supply chain back. and you can see why. I mean, whole towns, communities, in very short order, found their economic raison d'être disappearing. So we had a period of enormous, by historic standards, enormous openness. And whereas previous eras of globalization have become very open in terms of trade, we also had openness in terms of movement of people. Again, it was different in different countries, but you can see why a lot of people in the Midlands, in the partly deindustrialized parts of the United Kingdom, deindustrialization had gone on for many decades, started in the 1970s. But people who, perhaps their factory had closed down in the 1990s and moved to China or Vietnam or somewhere. But then in the early 2000s, a whole workforce is imported into your country to compete with you. I mean, this seemed like a bit of a double whammy. This obviously was the result of the decisions taken by the British government itself. I mean, it was the British government that was most enthusiastic about enlarging the European Union in order partly to prevent the deepening. And indeed, the two reasons why Britain is leaving the European Union are both entirely the result of British initiatives, both enlargement and, you might say, the single market, which was initially a partly British project. So we had this parallel development within Europe. We had an even more intense form of kind of local globalization in the shape of the European Union, which from the early 90s onwards became a far more interventionist institution in the democratic everyday life of our countries. Many people, of course, hadn't really noticed this. This was mainly something for technocrats and policymakers. They really did notice after 2004 in the UK, when suddenly a whole lot of Poles and Slovakians came to live next door and work with them in their fish finger factories. And I think on the whole, they were not hostile to the individual Poles and Slovakians, but they did think, hang on a sec, what about national citizenship? Do we not have a priority in labour markets or welfare states? And they discovered that they didn't. That this idea of kind of European citizenship that had sort of crept up on them meant that essentially it was illegal to discriminate in favour of your own national citizens. Really quite an extraordinarily radical idea. So I think a lot of people felt that this, you can see my list of openings, and then of course we had the kind of competence question. We had these various disasters. Who could have predicted 9/11? But we had 9/11. We then had perhaps a rather disastrous response to 9/11 in the shape of the Iraq War. We had the financial crisis of 2008. We had the refugee crisis. All of these things raised big questions, at the very least, about not so much the competence of our political classes, but the kind of the political instincts of our political classes. All of this fed in, I think, to the Brexit and Trump decisions. And underlying this is what I was mentioning right at the beginning. Underlying this, we had the emergence, I think, of new forms of politics, a shift, if you like, away from the traditional socio-economic politics that had dominated most European societies for most of the post-war period, in which the basic units were essentially social class. The issues were about market v state, size of the public sector, arguments about equality and incentives, and so on. This is the familiar centre-left, centre-right conflict of much of the last 60 or 70 years. Now that doesn't disappear completely. Obviously that hasn't disappeared completely by any means, but it's been kind of overlaid in many of our societies by a much more socio-cultural conflict between these two sort of meta worldviews that I described earlier. The people that see the world from anywhere and the people that see the world from somewhere. I just need to unpack these concepts a little bit. So the anywhere's not an elite, as I say, not an elite. not metropolitan liberal elites. They're a subset of anywheres, but they are not the whole picture. Anywheres are about 20-25% of the population in the UK. It's probably roughly similar in Germany. They tend to be people who are highly educated, at least an undergraduate degree, possibly a further degree. They tend to be mobile. Now, this is perhaps a peculiarly British thing, or the degree of mobility is a peculiarly British thing because of our, we still have an overwhelming tradition of residential higher education, residential universities. That's much less true in continental Europe. Elite universities, elites often go to, in Germany either abroad or to residential universities, but most people go to university in their hometown. It's true in America as well. Half of American students live at home. In the UK, that is not the case. The numbers are declining a little bit as more working class and ethnic minority students go to university and don't wish to leave home or can't afford to. But the vast majority, still about 75% of students, leave home. And this is a very important cultural fact. It's a marvellous thing. I mean, I went away to university for 3 years. You meet new people, you discover new worlds. For the individual, it's a great benefit. For society as a whole, I think there's quite a high cost to it. It creates a great value division in our society between the kind of those who stay and those who go. And higher status lives, higher status occupations are overwhelmingly connected with leaving. In the UK, this is exacerbated by the over-domination of London in our political economy, in our lives generally. Anyway, so the anywheres in Britain tend to be educated and mobile, and the combination of those two things are essential, I think, in understanding the worldview of the average anywhere, which tends to be comfortable with social change, tends to be in favour of autonomy and openness and social fluidity. All of these things come relatively easily to anywheres, and indeed they benefit from openness in many ways, but both as kind of affluent members of a society, but also intelligent, creative people have a kind of vested interest in openness. The more free data is to kind of move across borders, the more kind of raw material we have for our lives. So there are various sort of worldview biases that I think your typical anywhere, someone who, and also it's very important to remember the way that kind of identity works here. I think this is Talcott Parsons, the incredibly boring American sociologist, used to write these sort of chemistry textbooks of functionalist sociology. But he did come up with one really useful observation about human identity, this spectrum that he talked about between achieved and ascribed identities. An achieved identity is one in which people feel that they've created themselves in some ways. They are the result, they are the consequence of their own achievements. They've passed exams when they were young, they've gone to more or less good universities, they have more or less successful professional careers, they are masters of their own fate. And that gives you a sense, I think probably most of us in this room have achieved identities, and it's a remarkably good thing to have. You have a sense, it gives you a sense of yourself as autonomous, and makes it possible for you to kind of fit in most places, anywhere in fact. And that is a very important divide, I think, between anywheres and somewheres. Somewheres tend to have, well, I'll come on to them in a sec. Anyway, I think I've sort of done with anywheres, really. As I say, about 20-25% of the population, growing quite fast, particularly as a result of the rapid expansion of higher education, which is a great machine for producing anywheres. So we'll leave them on one side. We do have, there's a very big group. By the way, I've invented these labels, anywheres and somewheres. I have not invented these value groups. They really are there in the data, as you academics like to say. If you look at the British social attitude surveys, they're not written down there. You have to kind of interrogate the data. You have to look at all sorts of different attitudes towards openness, towards immigration, towards security versus liberty, all of these kinds of ideas. But they are there if you ask the questions of the data. So they really are. I mean, one might argue about the precise proportions that I've attributed to these different categories. It's a bit fuzzy at the edges, and it also it's not really meant to work to explain individual lives and biographies. I mean, one can have sort of sociological parlour games. It's another reason why I think the book did quite well. People love a sociological parlour game. Am I an anywhere or a somewhere or an in-betweener? But it does, our lives are too kind of complex and idiosyncratic to sort of fit neatly into these categories. It's more, think of it more like sort of the way we talk about working class and middle class. These are big, fuzzy worldview categories. But I think they do have some use in trying to understand what's going on. So we've got the anywheres. There is a big in-betweener group, by the way. About 25% of people have an almost equal balance of the two worldviews, somewhere and anywhere worldviews, but then somewheres themselves. Somewheres tend to be much less well-educated than anywheres, tend to be much less mobile. About 65% of the British population still live within 20 miles of where they lived when they were 12, or was it 14 years old? So we're less mobile than we think often, despite Britain being a relatively small country. Somewheres tend to value, again, the things you'd expect people who are more rooted to value: security, familiarity. They tend also to have, whereas the anywheres have achieved identities, the somewheres have mainly ascribed identities, meaning that they are sort of connected to those things about yourself that you cannot change. What am I? I'm white, male, British, and presumably always will be. Somewheres tend to have much stronger group attachments than anywheres. Anywheres tend to, however left-wing they are, they tend to be pretty individualistic, partly because of the mobile achieved identity allows them to be so. Somewheres tend to have much stronger attachments to place and to group, to kind of people like them, whatever they are, whether they're a Scottish farmer or a working class Geordie or a Cornish housewife. They're connected to place and group in a way that anywheres are not. That makes their identities much more potentially discomforted by rapid social change. I think those are the two crucial differences, I think, in worldview as regards recent political events are that somewheres tend to have much stronger group attachments and tend to be much more wary of social change, whereas anywheres have much weaker group attachments and tend to be comfortable with and welcome social change. One of the main criticisms of my thesis has been that, it's all very simplistic and binary. And at a certain level it is. I mean, like I say, there are lots of binary things in the world. And this is a kind of socio-cultural version of the kind of middle class, working class distinction. No one goes around saying, working class, middle class are far too binary. Binaries can be quite useful. But as I say, this is less binary than it seems. If you read my book, you'll find there are all sorts of shades of grey. There are all sorts of different kinds of anywheres, all sorts of different kinds of somewheres. The more extreme anywheres are, the kind of global, I call them the global villagers. They're the people that Theresa May rather clumsily described in her famous speech as if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Of course, she's right. Technically, because there is no world government. If you're a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. It enormously alienated a lot of perfectly decent people. It was typical of Theresa May's clumsiness. All she needed to do was to preface it by saying, there's nothing wrong with being internationally minded or internationally connected, But there is a problem if too many of our most influential and affluent people stop feeling any connection to national social contracts. That is a real problem for our societies. And I think she was right to point that out, although, as I say, she did it in a rather candid way. Oh, okay, oh, right. Okay, I mean, I do want to stress that both of these worldviews are obviously completely decent and legitimate, at least in their mainstream form. I mean, like I say, there's spectrums. We've got the kind of global villages at one end of the anywhere spectrum. We've got genuine xenophobes and authoritarians at the kind of bottom end of the somewhere spectrum. But 3-5% of the population, perhaps a little bit more in some areas. People are asked, do you have to be white to be properly British? I think the number of people who say that now is about 8%. So, this is not good guys versus bad guys. These are both perfectly legitimate worldviews, and one of those worldviews has felt very seriously underrepresented in our democracies over recent years, and in the case of Brexit, have taken the opportunity to push back against that underrepresentation. I think about of the 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit, I think 3 million, was it, had not voted in the preceding 5 general elections. That feeling that they're all the same. And of course, they are all the same, in the sense that, anywheres have, I think we'll have to skip a couple. Yeah, I mean, this is, the anywhere domination of our society is kind of, in a way, one of my main themes. I mean, I'll kind of rush through it now. Perhaps we can come back to this, but I mean, the economy, we call it the knowledge economy. Obviously, it benefits those people who are highly educated. We've had, in recent times, I mean, a huge stripping away, I would say, of the status attached to so many forms of non-graduate employment. It's one of the, if I was asked, one of the biggest factors behind Brexit is that. We've had an over-rapid expansion of higher education, in my view, in the UK. Nearly 50% of school leavers now go on to some form of higher education. And it's very undifferentiated as well. We don't have sort of Fachhochschulers or something like the community colleges in the US. You either go to an FE college, which is pretty remedial in many ways, or you go to a kind of classic 3-year academic university. And as I said earlier, you will probably go as a boarder as well. You'll go, you'll leave home in order to go. And I think this, as I say, massive expansion of higher education, continuing neglect, not here, but in the UK, continuing neglect of vocational and apprenticeship, other forms of post-school, high status post-school. There isn't really a high status post-school option unless you go to university in the UK. Massive economic and openness to immigration, the double whammy, I talked about that earlier. There's a kind of bias, anywhere is a very public realm people, there's a kind of bias against domesticity, a bias against the private realm, a kind of tendency to see men and women not only as equal but essentially the same, what I call sort of androgynous feminism, which has had a huge influence on policy, I mean hugely disproportionate influence on policy relative to the number of people that actually believe that. We've had the shrinkage of the democratic space. Think of all those things that used to be subject to national parliamentary or National Assembly discussions that have kind of been removed to the committees of the WTO or the European Union. And of course, we've chosen to do this in some ways. We've removed central bank independence, the much greater independence of the judiciary. I mean, all of these things perfectly justified probably, in each individual case. You can see why it's happened. But all of those decisions, when they're removed from the democratic contest and decided in committees, will be decided according to anywhere priorities. Almost universally will be decided according to anywhere priorities. The whole social mobility problem in the UK particularly, as I touched on earlier, the idea that to lead a successful life you have to leave. I heard Justine Greening, Secretary of State for Education in the UK, a couple of years ago. She comes from Rotherham in South Yorkshire. She gave a speech to the Social Mobility Commission in London, and she said, I remember growing up in Rotherham and dreaming of owning my own home, having a well-paid job, having a challenging professional career, and I knew I couldn't have those things in Rotherham. This is quite an extraordinary thing to say. Rotherham is a town of 120,000 people. It's half an hour commute from Sheffield, a town of 600,000 or 700,000 people. That whole conurbation has a population of about 1.5 million people. The idea that you have to go and live in Putney in order to live an achieved life is extraordinary. I mean, and yet, I mean, there's an element of truth. I mean, the fact that she could sort of say that so kind of innocently, I think, is extraordinary. Anyway, I'm nearly there. one more minute. Let me just kind of try and. I mean, I haven't really got onto the second part, the democratic settlement. But I do think there are some trends. Okay, it may have come at quite a high cost in terms of Brexit and other things. The kind of protest, the kind of, you know, it's a kind of lashing out from people who have felt unrepresented, have felt their worldview and their values unrepresented in our politics. People who, one of the absolutely key things here too, I think that almost the sort of meta explanation for so much of this is the kind of emergence of cognitive ability as the kind of gold standard of human esteem. Cognitive ability is the gold standard of human esteem. Now, obviously, cognitive ability is a wonderful thing. We want lots of clever people, and according to the Flynn effect, we have more of them in the modern world, and that's a jolly good thing. But by definition, half of the population are always in the bottom half of the cognitive ability spectrum. And cognitive ability has become, I think, too much. Somebody wrote me a letter, having read my book, saying that a good society requires a balance between the head, the hand, and the heart. I remember thinking, oh dear, this is a little bit new age. But actually, I think there's a profound human truth in that, and I think many of our societies have become, I mean, I shouldn't really be saying this in a Wissenschaftszentrum, but have become too tilted towards the Wissenschaftszentrums of Europe in some ways, and we have diminished the traditional respect and value of other human aptitudes. You know, it's not just passing exams and having analytical intelligence that counts. There are all sorts of other aptitudes, and I think, well, perhaps we can talk about this later, but I think there are some promising signs that we are kind of, you know, we are recognizing this unbalancing of our society and starting to do something about it. But I think one of the reasons we're doing that is precisely because people have used the power of the vote, they have used the wonders of modern democracy to say to the political classes, no, you've created a society that is comfortable for you guys, but you've created a society that is not necessarily comfortable for us guys. And I mean, I don't go along with this, Tony Blair and others talk about left v right has been replaced by open v closed. I've never met anybody who wants to live in a closed society. But a lot of people think that the forms of openness that we have created, going back to my first slide, the forms of openness we've created in the last 30 years have not been in everybody's interests. And people want to live in an open society that is more attuned to their needs and their priorities and their values. And I think we are in the process. That's why I think this pushback, this democratic pushback, is not to be mourned. It's in some ways to be welcomed. As I said, it has some ugly manifestations. Stefan. It has some ugly manifestations, but I think we should thank our electors in some ways. They have used their political power to say, we don't like this, can you please amend it? That is what they're saying to us, and I think we should. Thank you very much.